Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we've got a great episode in store for you, all about how to transition from bodybuilding to functional fitness and the common mistakes that people might make. So you can expect to learn how to get the most from your training and avoid the pitfalls that often lead to injuries or just slow down your results as you switch from bodybuilding to a more functional style of training, which is quite different. This was actually an episode requested by listeners. So just a friendly reminder that if you are keen to hear more on a certain topic, reach out to us at lunge.lift on Instagram. And we're always looking to try and provide the most helpful and relevant content for you. So anything you want to hear more about, do drop us a DM and we'll add it to our schedule. Before we get into it, a quick thank you to our show sponsors, as always. TheTrainingStimulus.com. Please check it out if you would like to learn more about movement mechanics. Wit-fitness.com. Use our discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. And Hytro. Use discount code LL20 to get 20% off your blood flow restriction apparel. All right, let's get into it. Rob, this is right in your wheelhouse, going from bodybuilding to functional fitness. Lots of personal experience and also with your clients as well. Where do we start?
Well, to be honest with you, mate, it's one of the, when I look at the people transitioning now, it's a lot more accepted, which is just like when you talk about other types of transitioning as well. But the thing is, what I find interesting is the levels of people transitioning into the world of functional fitness. And the reason I say this is because we've just had down at March on Stratford a IFBB pro, Joe Brightman, come down to the gym. So IFBB pro, for those who don't know, is pretty much, you're talking about top level bodybuilding. So top level bodybuilder, won a bunch of stuff, like insane physique. Then now trying to do functional fitness and now trying to do gymnastics. So like we had our last episode where we were talking all about movement efficiency and stuff. It's such a different world. And now to see more and more people not only getting involved and trying these like functional fitness coming from bodybuilding, but now it's a bit more and more people are inquisitive, which is great, because when I go back to, my bodybuilding career was 2 shows and one was only the proper one. So one proper show, which I actually prepped properly for. So I can't really say I'm necessarily a bodybuilder per se, but I've always had a passion for good mind muscle connection, good bodybuilding movements, and just getting a good pump. So, and then when I was moving into more of a CrossFit style type of training, the looks I used to get in the Virgin Active I was working at the time, because again, CrossFit was still kind of just coming through to the UK and it was still not accepted. So it was interesting, and it was like you kind of, oh no, CrossFit's crap, and then you try do some sneaky pull up somewhere else. So whereas now it's just like everyone's like, oh, what's that? How'd you do that? It's great. It really is. And I think what's really important though is for people to understand the differences between the two, because otherwise to some people it's just training. To some people it's, oh my God, circus movements, looking stupid, doing like these extravagant things which you do not need to do. Or there's just people like, I have no interest in that. So it's understanding, I think, first of all, what both are and what the purpose of both of them are, and then understanding, is the transition across from one to the other for you, or do you need to fully transition, or can you hybrid the both?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is a very common situation, especially over the last few years, where a quick history lesson, I guess, is that most health and fitness education and approaches were spawned back in the days where bodybuilding was the only common style of training. Everything was about looking a certain way. And, back in the golden era of bodybuilding when Arnold was massive, I think that's what got a lot of people into fitness, full stop. And so the techniques and the exercises and the execution were all developed with that in mind. Like, essentially, how do you build your muscles? Because that's what it's all about. It's either hypertrophy or cardio. And those are the only 2 things that people would ever be working on. And a lot of people cut their teeth with those approaches, trainers and athletes as well. Even like in sport, if you look back to that, The Last Dance, and Michael Jordan's doing his training in the gym, it was all bodybuilding stuff. Like everything he was doing with his trainer was just bodybuilding, because that was the only stuff that people knew about back then. But as the industry has evolved, we've had a much bigger emphasis on performance and output, and actually what's the purpose for conditioning our body? What are we conditioning it for? And now we're having people who go straight into functional fitness because they have no interest in bodybuilding and they just want to perform in a certain way. So what happens to that middle group of people who started in those days all bodybuilding, and now they're realizing that they want to do something a little bit more functional? They want to move a little bit better and not just focus on pure aesthetics. And because they've got such a back catalogue of bodybuilding in their body, they're not in the same situation as somebody who's starting fresh and just go straight into functional fitness. They have to consider their training history to put themselves in the best position to get the most out of the functional training. And in some situations, they've got a head start, but in other situations, they're probably at a bit of a disadvantage because they've done so much training in a different style. They need to undo slightly to let themselves progress optimally in functional fitness.
Yeah, because for me, I found the head start that I kind of got by the strength that I gained and just the understanding of how my body works meant when I got into functional fitness and I was doing a lot of gymnastics and just weightlifting in general, stuff like that, I had the awareness of what my body does in space and time. So it meant learning the movements wasn't too bad. It took time, as everything does, which it should do. But I felt I was able to grasp it relatively quickly. Where I think the speed bump for me came was where I had a fair amount of strength going into it. My ego, so my age was a massive part of it. So the ego was there, which meant I always wanted to lift the most possible. So then if it was technically right, wasn't always the focus compared to did it look kind of right for Instagram. And then having a lot more strength just also then meant I was probably doing things way before my tissues and my joints and stuff had actually grown accustomed to move that explosively and that aggressively, essentially, through movements. So then injuries were a lot more common because my ability was kind of already there. So I had to actually hone that back in. And when you're a bit younger and stuff like that and fresh face into it, you're like, oh, I don't need to slow down. I'll rehab this shoulder and get back into some snatching. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. But now when I watch people do this now, I'm just like, okay, cool, right. Okay, you can make the mistake and I'm going to let you to some degree, but you also have to, at least I'm going to tell you what I did wrong and what I've learned from that. And if you want to implement some of it, then crack on. If you don't and you want to kind of make your own mistakes so you learn from them, then be my guest, because that is all part of the journey as well.
Exactly. So, I think we've touched on it, but let's say it explicitly. One of the key differences between bodybuilding versus functional fitness is that bodybuilding centers around hypertrophy. It's all about growing your muscles to make them look a certain way. So we want to overload them through high volume, time under tension, and metabolic stress. And we're often looking to take individual muscles or muscle groups to failure so that they grow bigger. And this is in contrast to functional fitness, which is much more about performance, like what can your body do from an output perspective. So that could be strength in a given movement or work capacity, so much more of a conditioning focus in either, could be pure cardiovascular, but it could also be in a mixed modal workout. So you're trying to develop this ability to just get work done without, like in the purest form, without a consideration for your aesthetics. It's just, if you compete in CrossFit, there's no points for looking good. It's literally just how much can you lift, how fast can you do it, and what's your total work capacity. That's essentially what all the tests boil down to. So I think that key difference has a lot of implications in how you go about choosing movements and how you go about executing movements, which we're going to touch on shortly.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the idea of trying to take your muscles, say, to failure from the bodybuilding background, that's, I think, probably one of the hardest transitions for most, because Then when you're trying to learn a skill, taking things to failure is probably the furthest from thing that you want to do, because taking it to failure just means you're going above and beyond what you should be doing. And when you're trying to learn something, you want to stay in that threshold of, okay, this kind of feels easy, so I'm going to repeat it. And that's where I see, and I've seen over the years, most people's biggest concern with trying to do the both, because they have the bodybuilder mindset coming into the functional fitness space and wondering why all their efforts that they've done for the previous, say, 10 plus years or whatever, aren't reflecting in this mixed modal state. And also you want to think, if you've created such, so using Joe as an example here of just say a man with a lot of muscle, think about how much oxygen that body is now going to be requiring, going from something where you're quite static and isolated in movements to then going to do full body, and the amount of blood being shunted around the body, it's insane. Just wondering what that body's doing. And for me, I'm fascinated by this journey, because it's of such an extreme of just watching one to the other. And I get to see it firsthand. It's great because I've seen things like this online, but to actually witness it and to see, like, watching his output on an erg, for instance, it's insane. So much power and getting pretty fit at it. But then as soon as you then put it in a mixed modal fashion, then it all changes. And this is obviously where I think the problems start to arise, understanding that transition from each.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really nice talking point around the failure, in that in a bodybuilding session, you're trying to grow a given muscle. So you might isolate it out and get it working on its own without any help from neighboring muscle groups. And the goal of the set is to take it to its limit. So it could be from a strength perspective, but it's also from a metabolic perspective. So you're trying to empty it of its capacity to do more work so that it literally can't do another rep. And as Rob said there, if you do that in a workout, say you're doing a set of pull-ups, say kipping pull-ups in CrossFit, so you're using your whole body to try and get your chin over the bar. If your bicep hits failure and it can no longer provide you any force, you're then potentially going to have to end the set because it can't contribute anything to control that last part of getting the chin over the bar. And from a hypertrophy perspective, that's a good thing, because we want to get to that point, which tells the bicep to grow bigger. But from a performance perspective, it's the weak link in the chain. So now that bicep is going to stop you scoring any reps. So it's the opposite of what we want. So bodybuilders have spent a long time conditioning their muscles to get used to being taken to their absolute limit, so they cannot do any more. Whereas in functional fitness, we want to be teaching the body to operate as an overall team, a system of full body muscles, so that we can get the task done as efficiently as possible without hitting that point of failure. So we've almost got to change the default setting for the body for overload this muscle until it can't do any more, to do as much work as possible without getting overloaded. And I think when you have a really strong mind-muscle connection and you're used to doing certain exercises to finish off or kill a certain muscle group, it's a very difficult mindset shift, because trying to make it easy rather than trying to make it hard is what will allow you to increase your performance from an output perspective, even though it's very different and potentially less good for the goal of hypertrophy.
Yeah, I mean, what really brought this to light for me was when I was talking to him, how someone with, say, 10 plus years of training experience and had never done a push press and rarely does deadlifts, and I'm just like, that's like a staple in my training. I'm like, what? Like, because they're just not made to grow. Like, don't get me wrong, deadlifts are great for, say, building muscle and so forth, but there's more optimal ways to grow muscle directly. And that's what, as we've been talking about here, with bodybuilders, you want to do it in isolation. So you want to say, well, I want to target my glutes, my hamstrings, my back, my lower back, rather than let me do an exercise which works it all together. Because then your body's going to be finding, as you say, it's going to find its strongest links and probably overuse that compared to other bits. So you can't target the areas of the body like you can with isolated movements. And so then thinking about, I think most people, if they were going to walk into the gym, we need to kind of now break down how to actually transition, because I think listen to this might be cool. Okay, maybe I just need to start doing more full body movements. Is that the answer? Or is it, just keep doing what I'm doing and maybe adding in one piece in one of my sessions? And how do you think we should go about it?
Yeah, I think that is a big part of it, is doing more full body compound movements. So I think one of the key things for me that I see people who've come from a bodybuilding background is because they're so used to training in isolation, their movement patterns and their muscle sequencing aren't great in the full body compound movements, because they are used to firing those muscles on their own rather than in a coordinated team effort. So something like a push press or a deadlift are a great example, in that if you've never sequenced your lower body with your upper body to have a full body drive up to overhead for a push press, it's weird to be pressing something overhead and actually the majority of the force come from your legs. That doesn't tend to happen in bodybuilding. And if they did, then they'd be all about the negative, trying to work the shoulders on the way down rather than the leg drive above. Whereas from a performance perspective, it's all about the leg drive to lift the most weight and to conserve energy and use the most efficient blend of muscle groups.
Yeah.
And the same goes for a deadlift. Go on.
No, it's just thinking about the push press there. And you're saying, like, for me, when I'm coaching it as well at the moment, and adding a pause in the dip so that people are actually feeling their full foot loaded, they're feeling the legs, they're feeling their glutes, they're not just using this spring necessarily to get them up. So they're gaining an understanding of, actually, fuck, the lower body is doing a lot of work here because it's supposed to. And then actually feel it. And when I'm saying to people, I'm going, you should be using so much legs and shrugging so the bar goes above the head part of the way without you doing any pressing, and you're literally just locking out at the end. And then when it comes to a jerk, you're doing even less. You're trying to get under it even faster, so you're doing even less pressing because you're not supposed to do any pressing. So it's like, I understand how it becomes quite tricky to understand this transition between the two, because it just seems counterintuitive, and to unlearn essentially, and especially then, when we mentioned earlier about coming from the background of, say, powerlifting and, say, bodybuilding into CrossFit. That was one of my biggest weaknesses for trying to understand how to be more efficient. And when I said about my ego taking over, it was because then I always wanted to go RX with the weights, so I'm going to save this for in a second. So carry on with the deadlift.
Okay. Well, put a pin in that one. But the compound stuff, essentially what you're trying to do is develop the optimal balance of muscle groups. So say you're doing something like a push press or a deadlift, you want the whole body to work together in harmony in the best work allocation possible. So generally that means the bigger muscle groups doing more of the work. And I think the thing that's the biggest difficulty for bodybuilders is that you're not necessarily trying to feel a given muscle group. Like in a perfect world, if you do something like a deadlift or squats, you want all the muscles of your body to be doing their fair share of work. So it is really in its truest sense, a full body movement. And the classic bodybuilding approach to those exercises would be, I'm doing deadlifts to grow X muscle group. So they're really trying to tap into the mind muscle connection of that muscle group, which can actually negatively impact the total weight lifted or the total number of reps that you're able to perform. There are nuanced situations where you might want to do that if you're trying to correct a movement pattern because you don't use a muscle group enough, for example. But by and large, the most efficient way to do any movement is let the subconscious take over, and through skill development, which we talked about last episode and in a previous episode as well, it will work out the best sequencing, timing, and work allocation between the body. I think about throwing a javelin or any max effort, max performance sporting movement. No one's thinking about an individual muscle. They're just thinking about achieving the task, and the subconscious, through skill acquisition, will coordinate it in the best way possible. And in functional fitness, that's more akin to what we want. We want the body to be moving as efficiently as possible to achieve the task. We're trying to pick something up, put it down. We're trying to move ourselves through space. We're not trying to get one muscle to do most of the work and get close to failure. Like in life, you don't want your muscles failing on you in any situation, really. No. So we just want to get stuff done. We want to move ourselves. We want to move other things. And that's what functional fitness should be preparing us to do. So if we are obsessing over one muscle doing all the work in a given movement, I would class that as a bodybuilding approach rather than a functional approach to achieve performance and output in a given movement or task.
Yeah, and I think just like you mentioned there about the deadlift, like every time I deadlift, my main focus before I've lifted it, before I've even grabbed the bar, is to brace as hard as I possibly can to connect my upper body with my lower body, then hold the bar and pull the slack out the bar so that all of the weight is going through my body. So all I think about is standing up. So I'm not thinking about what muscle firing this, that, how am I going to, I'm literally just thinking stand up with this weight. So
Yeah.
yes, it's going to be leg drive into the ground, but I've created so much tension through the body that then the whole body is X amount of kilos, whatever's on the bar plus me. Like that is what it is. And I think that obviously that kind of dives into the world a bit more powerlifting and stuff, but functional fitness is including strength training. And I'd say getting your body to work as one is a very tricky thing to start to do, but is very manageable if you kind of go into it with purpose. And I think this is then where going on to our next point of going lighter is key, because if you have the purpose of, right, I'm trying to make sure I'm using my full body here, when you go in heavier and you naturally know you can press a certain amount of weight overhead or whatever like that, that's what you're going to be doing, because you're thinking, right, this is how I'm pressing this overhead. Whereas you're trying to learn, say, the push press, using this as the example. So am I feeling my legs, my drive? Am I feeling the timing? Like, am I feeling that movement rather than necessarily quads, glutes, back, shoulders, traps? Now what? It's like I'm literally thinking, throw the dumbbells overhead with my shoulders. Whoop, like that. Oh, they're good. And then you're going to grab them at some point. Or
Exactly. Yeah. So by going a little bit lighter, we get the opportunity to learn a new skill. Whereas if you're close to failure, your old patterns are always going to kick in. And focusing on that nice, fluid, actually low tension way of doing a movement. So like a push press, you don't want to be in tension throughout the whole movement. There is a moment of weightlessness, and using speed and momentum is a part of function. Like if you want to perform to your best, they are your friends. Whereas speed and momentum in the bodybuilding world are cheating, because you're using other forces than your own muscles to get the job done. But we want to overload the muscles, so it's away from the stimulus that we're seeking. So by going lighter, we can provide a learning opportunity to use the body as a whole without focusing on overload and getting close to failure.
I think this is then where the argument for heavier load comes in for struggling with mobility and positions, because then people that are a bit larger, then say they've built all this muscle, don't have the same room that most people do. So like, it's quite embarrassing. The reason I'm using this, guys, is because obviously this is a first-hand experience that I'm having of someone who's massive compared to me, right? So I'm like hold the bar like this, and I'm like, he's like, my biceps are too big for that, and I'm just like it. And it's like, so then when I had a bit of a chat with him about like some handstand push-ups the other day, and I was like, we need to make sure, well, at the moment we're trying to fit a square peg into a circle hole, and that my position is like most people's position, because I've got quite an average trainee physique, right? Whereas you're above average, so you need to find your position to do a handstand push-up at the moment. And maybe when you lose a bit of muscle and so forth, you get a bit smaller, hopefully you can get into these positions better. So mobility and positional work a lot of the time is we start to think, okay, let's load up the bar so it can actually sit in my front rack, because I physically can't hold the front rack. Or like same with the deadlift, I can't feel it because I've got 60 kilos on the bar. It's like, but this is part of the problem, and it's a really fine line to balance, because it's like we want enough weight on the bar, say for someone say it's quite large, to be able to get some kind of feedback. Otherwise, an empty barbell will just do nothing. But we need to start to prioritize a bit of this mobility and positional work, so that when we get to the heavier loads down the line, these are in that subconscious that we spoke about there. That it's just you're just doing it without thinking.
Exactly, and I think it dovetails perfectly with the compound, in that with the compound movements, and the goal is we're trying to lay foundations so that the body is resilient against the movements that we're going to add volume and load to in future. So for the positions and mobility required to get into these shapes, you might need some load. We go deep in that in our mobility stability episode, which is worth checking out if you haven't heard it. But essentially, when somebody's bodybuilding, they'll have a very high work capacity in very specific scenarios. So they can potentially do themselves more damage than somebody with no training age whatsoever. So in the conversion from bodybuilding to functional fitness, we need to make sure they can get into the right shapes to give the right muscles the opportunity to get involved in those patterns. And having a massive emphasis on positions and technique and skill gives us a better chance of using the right muscles, rather than, say, in that push press example, somebody has really developed triceps. They're going to be trying to do as much of that movement as possible with their triceps rather than using their lower body and even their shoulders. So there is a Goldilocks amount of weight required, so that it's difficult enough for them to need to use their legs and other muscle groups, and they can't just do overhead press with their triceps. But then if it's too much, then their default patterns are going to kick in and take over, and they're just going to lean into what they've always done, which is attempt to overload triceps, which is a skill question. Like how well are they able to take on the new movement pattern to better allocate the effort across the muscle groups? And it's hard to give a concrete always do this, always do that, because you need to see somebody do the movement to know whether it's too much or too little. But it is a big consideration that bodybuilders need to have as they go into developing these new skills.
Yeah, and I think the lightness, I think for me, if I was trying to picture it, say with a deadlift, and someone that say got a bodybuilder that could probably comfortably lift 180 on the bar, you'd probably be thinking around that 100 to 120 kilo mark for trying to learn the skill. Now, I know these are arbitrary numbers because, as you just said, it's quite hard to actually put a number on it. But percentage-wise of how much that should feel, you should be looking probably around that 60-ish percent, 50, 60%, where you think, I could do this all day. But if you did, you would actually burn out a lot quicker than you think. So having that 50 to 60% loading will, one, help with positions, because then it'll be enough load to help you get into it. But then two, give you enough of a stimulus where you feel like you're doing something, because that is part of the battle. As in, if you feel like you're doing nothing, you're not getting any feedback, so you don't know if you're doing it right. And you're just like, I'm just moving around. So it's like, it adds intentionality to what you're doing. And for when we're starting to think about intensity, it's when we discuss functional fitness, the word intensity is the kind of, I think, at the forefront of a lot of that, because people say, oh, well, it's going to be moving weights fast and heavy and this, because it's what's glamorized essentially within functional fitness. But reality is, it's functional fitness is the ability to kind of really mix modal stuff, being able to go from, say, an aerobic piece into an anaerobic piece, and maybe into a strength piece, into some gymnastics, being able to blend all these elements, not necessarily all in one workout, but having the capacity to kind of do all these things. And adding intensity in too early doors kind of takes away the ability for you to understand the intensities given for each task. And this is like a reason why I say this is because when I think about someone going from, say, just doing some cardio work, and then they get a really good understanding of how to, pace on the ergs and, put in power, how things feel. But if their first lot of experiences are kind of doing, like, say, a simple workout, something like, say, rowing and burpees over a row or something like that, or just burpees, rowing and burpees, like, that would absolutely trash you, and you're not getting the ability to understand how to pace the row. You're not getting an understanding of how to perform the burpee to the best capacity. So I see this a lot, and when people are sharing how to do functional bodybuilding or functional fitness and stuff like that, and it's like these Metcons that are like, they're pretty like solid Metcons. I'm like, that if someone's never done any of this, there's literally just going to be enduring a workout. This is the problem of it. This is a whole separate topic, which we won't go into right now, but like picking workouts from Instagram, it's like they have their place, and I think it's great. And I like to post stuff very often myself, and it's like, sometimes there's a bit of inspiration. Oh, okay, that's quite cool. I do try to put a bit of intentionality behind what I'm doing, and so that people understand what that snapshot is. But if you're new to this and trying to get into this world, picking Instagram workouts for your functional fitness journey probably isn't going to be the best. And this is you should find a coach or find some coaches that will help you take you on this journey. Find a gym that will take you through the journey appropriately, because the stress on the body will suddenly go from 50% manageable stress to suddenly like 80-90%, because you're like, I'm doing everything and I don't know how I'm doing it. I'm just moving.
Yeah. I think I made it clear in past episodes my thoughts on random workouts. They're
Yeah.
not very, not something I recommend. But yeah, I think just to go back to your point on the intensity, the way I view this is that when you're switching into functional fitness, they're all new skills, and all these new movement patterns, and even a movement pattern you might be familiar with, but you're doing it in a slightly different way. So, for example, you might have done front squats to try and target your quads, whereas now we're doing front squats because we want to develop strength overall. So we might do them in a slightly different way, trying to get more glutes and hams involved in that front squat pattern. So it is a new skill, and your execution will be slightly different. If you're doing that in a mixed modal workout with loads of fatigue and potentially conflict from the other movement patterns that you're doing in the session, it's going to be a huge amount, like it's going to be much more difficult to do it in the new style because you're out of breath, because the adrenaline's high, you don't have time to really think because you're trying to do it as quickly as possible. So you're not creating an environment for your body to learn. Like imagine if you're trying to change the way you swung a golf club. That's my favorite example for skill acquisition. You're trying to make nuanced changes to like a really fine motor skill. Imagine trying to do that in between repeats of doing 500 meters on the rower. You do 500 meter row, your heart rate's at 95%, and then the coach is trying to tell you to change your path that's on the way to hit the ball. There's no chance of you actually being able to execute that change unless you're incredibly fit and have done that before. So doing the movement under fatigue is a different skill to doing the movement fresh. And I don't think that gets enough respect from people who have a lot of capacity. So you might be very strong, fresh, with no fatigue, with all the time in the world to concentrate on your cues. But it's a completely different scenario if you're doing that with loads of competing demands on your energy, focus, and attention. So these bodybuilders, this is one of the blessing and the curses, is that they might be very strong from doing bodybuilding, but the difference for them and their performance, fresh versus fatigued, is going to be greater than for somebody who doesn't have that history of training, because for them, they're not going to be as affected by the fatigue because their fresh output isn't very high to begin with. So for me, sprinkling in the intensity in small doses and generally in simpler movements with less confusion, I guess, for the body, gives the opportunity to feel the intensity, but not necessarily pollute the movement patterns, because no one doing a new skill is going to be able to do it with a 95% heart rate well. And what we're trying to do for these bodybuilders is improve their movement patterns. So we're sending mixed messages here. If we've spent loads of time at low heart rate, low fatigue with light weights, repatterning their squat, and then we ask them to squat heavy under fatigue when they don't know whether they're upside down or the right way up, doing handstand push-ups, we're not giving them a good chance of actually improving that motor pattern.
No, and this is why it's why I love being back into coaching, because in the workouts that we're currently doing down in Stratford, like we not only are we having the ability to coach people through how to do these mixed modal workouts, for instance, but like the workouts are, say, repeated to some degree with an ever so slight change over the 3 weeks or 2 to 3 weeks. So what that then gives us the ability to do is say, right, okay, where did I fuck up last week? What did I learn? Did I go too heavy? Did I go too fast? So then you're then starting to learn, because in today's society where we want everything now, it's very hard to say, let's get things in isolation, to like do an EMOM of just thrusters. So you're learning one full body skill. Like for me, if you had the ability to, and you want to start transitioning from bodybuilding to functional fitness, do some dumbbell thrusters and just do them. Do that as your only functional movement and start to feel what that feels like. Because anyone that does CrossFit or / functional fitness, thrusters are probably one of the worst movements. And it's just because the amount of fatigue across the full body, using your legs, using your shoulders, using everything to make this an efficient movement, I think is an unreal movement to do. And to do it as just one single exercise, it's a nice way to get into it. But then, as I was saying, if you have the ability, and you like where we're currently like coaching people that have never done functional fitness, done really any training, they're starting to learn mixed modal fitness, is we're coaching them through it, telling them kind of what to expect. They're having some pre-workout like warm-ups and stuff like that, getting the understanding of how the fatigue's going to feel. We're using workouts and movements in other days to kind of start to sprinkle into the later in the week. So people are starting to have it in an isolation way where we can do just that one movement, say like handstand push-ups or whatever the version. Then maybe later in the week, there haven't been yet, but later in the week, some handstand push-ups in a workout. So it's having them separate and understand when to put them in and how to deal with them is going to be one of the best ways you can.
Exactly. And I love what you said there about just focusing on one movement. And it's something I wanted to say later in the podcast.
Sorry,
which
mate.
is, no, it's perfectly timed. So basically, I think the temptation when somebody's switching from bodybuilding to functional fitness is to just go all in. So a complete wholesale change of training style. Like I was bodybuilding on Friday and on Monday, all in functional fitness. And your body does not like that sudden
Sounds
change.
like me.
Yeah, exactly. So learn from Rob's mistakes. But basically, when you have such a huge sudden system shock like that, that's when your body's most prone to freak out. You might get spasms, you might get tweaks because it's a completely different stress on the body. So Rob's approach there of just focusing on one or a small set of movement patterns to start developing the skill of doing those efficiently in a functional way rather than a bodybuilder focused way is a great way to slowly move over. So you can divide your session into two parts. It's almost like positions and patterns to teach it the skill of doing these new functional movements. And then you can do your heavy and hard training. And in a perfect world, it would be a gradual shift, almost like a slider of like going from 100% bodybuilding. You need to step 10% at a time to 90%, 80%, 70%. So you're ramping down the amount of bodybuilding you're doing while slowly ramping up the amount of functional movements you're doing. And having that as like almost like a part of a warm up to develop, something like an overhead squat is a great goal to have. If you can do a good overhead squat, that's laying loads of awesome foundations to unlock snatching, and it'll even improve your front squats as well if you have a good overhead squat. If you have that almost as like the skill development piece while you're fresh, then you can go into a bodybuilding session afterwards and slowly shift the balance of functional to bodybuilding work in your session so that your body has a slower ramp into it rather than that sudden system shock. Because another point we need to mention is that the demands on your physiology are quite distinct. Bodybuilding to functional fitness. In bodybuilding, the stress is almost entirely on the muscles because that's what you care about. Whereas in functional fitness, there's a lot more being asked of your tendons and ligaments. Things like box jumps when you're rebounding, double unders. You're going to greater ranges of motion generally overall in functional fitness. And tendons and ligaments take a lot longer to adapt than muscles do because they have less of a blood supply. So this is another way that bodybuilders can get caught out because their muscles can do loads of work, but their joints, ligaments, and tendons probably haven't adapted to the same degree. So they feel like they can keep going, and they could keep going, but they're going to get closer to the failure of those tendons and ligaments. So working within themselves to let those joints catch up with the muscles is another reason why going a bit lighter and progressing a little bit slower than you absolutely could is a good idea to let that connective tissue catch up with the well-developed muscular system.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, managing recovery is a skill. That's why people wear whoops, they wear heart rate monitors, they wear all these things to try and gauge of how their body, they lose the actual connection with themselves and they rely everything upon a watch saying, you're ready to go again. And I know you're a big fan of whoops, so I'm not going to criticize them. Well,
medium fan.
Oh, you're losing. All right, cool. But I don't want to lean too much into them because I know they have a place, but it's funny because if people go in with the thought process of, oh, okay, I could train 5 times a week, 6 times a week bodybuilding, I can do the same thing with workouts, especially if they've just dumped themselves into it and gone straight in and now doing workouts and everything. How much stress that body has now had to deal with, you don't know how long it takes to recover from them.
Yeah.
And the problem is because we feel it's a sadistic thing, but we're like, fuck, that was hard, but I like how hard that was because I want to now be better. So it's like you're doing it in this like really positive way of, I want to be better, I want to do more, I want to get good. And then suddenly the body's just like, look, I can't. Like, you've gone from seated to essentially full-blown sprint, and your body's like, I can't deal with this change. I'm going to have to stop you. And then you're going to go beyond, you'll be back, you're bedbound. It's like, you've got to, cool, chill, take your time. And it's hard because I think I mentioned this last episode as well and stuff. It's like, where I'm coaching at the moment, we're getting a lot of people getting into functional fitness, which I love because it's cool to see people experiencing this type of training, and they've come from nothing. So it's great. Like, they've come from no training at all. They get into experience like strength training, like bodybuilding stuff and workouts and conditioning. But to try and keep them reined in is like, I'm finding that balance to say, don't do that, to or slow down, to just crack on and make your mistake. Like, it's such a sweet spot, a sweet balance, and it's still, as a coach, I've been doing this for long enough, and it's finding just enough with that individual in front of you of how much you want to try and hold them back, where you don't want to discourage them. But it's more the recovery side of things, because you don't doubt that they could probably do the movements and end themselves. Everyone can end themselves, but it's just like, you're going to come to the gym again the next day, and then the next day, and you're going to wait till possibly the weekend or Sunday to recover until you start it all again on Monday. So it's like, because you don't want those rest days. So learning your recovery rate for heavy Metcons or just aerobic pieces is key.
Exactly. And I think this is another thing, is that bodybuilders are used to training really hard, but in a very different way. So you can take any muscle group to failure, like a big leg day will write you off, but that's still very different to a heavy Metcon. And the demands on your physiology are very distinct. And I think the common thing you see with these bodybuilders is that they'll do loads of Metcons during a week, and then they will be bedbound, just with zero energy, not necessarily injured. And they can't quite understand, because they're used to training very hard for a similar number of total hours per week. But a lot of bodybuilders don't do very much cardio. So from a metabolic point of view, they're asking a very different question of their body, and it's just not used to providing output in that way. So as we alluded to earlier, having a small sprinkling of the intensity to stepwise build it up so that you get used to doing that real high intensity or high volume output gives the body a chance to adapt, because it's not just a physiological adaptation from a muscle, joint, tendon, ligament point of view. It's also a metabolic adaptation that needs to change. You need to be conditioned to get used to outputting huge amounts of, supplying huge amounts of oxygen and ATP. The body actually needs to change its cellular makeup to be able to do that. And it is a different question to ask than just doing 4 sets of 8 to 12 to failure, which is the typical work output that bodybuilders will ask of their muscles.
Yeah, so we've kind of alluded to all these tips and stuff, but we'll put them into a bit of a practical tip takeaway for you guys. Like, if you are currently bodybuilding and seen some functional fitness online, or you've seen some friends do it and you want to get involved, first of all, crack on. Get stuck in and enjoy that first session. It's going to be a shit show, whatever it is anyway. But that's part of the fun, because you're going in, you're trying something brand new, but understand that it's probably going to feel absolutely terrible. You just, but afterwards you'll be like, do you know what? This is addictive, because it is. A lot of people that I know that have come from bodybuilding into functional fitness, it's just that thing of, because you're asking more of yourself to be better, and it's such a addicting trait I've personally found. I'm not saying that necessarily is, but we've kind of alluded to like dividing your training up and into certain segments, and like transitioning into it slowly, like you said there, with that 100% bodybuilding to 90, 80, 70, 60, and maybe say 50-50, because you might still want to maintain some bodybuilding stuff. So I think what's important with that transition is how you're going to be introducing the functional fitness movements. So when I say what is a functional fitness movements, that'll be basically doing things like gymnastics, full body exercises with, like, say, dumbbells, barbells or whatever, or even weightlifting and stuff.
Yeah. So exactly, get clear on the movements that you're missing. So are you able to do an overhead squat? Can you do a front squat? Hanging from a bar can you dead hang straight, or is your rib cage flared and you're missing shoulder range of motion? So in the first part of your sessions, I would focus on developing those positions, so doing specific mobility work to help you get into those shapes to lay the foundations to eventually train them later. And then in the later part of your session, you could either be doing your bodybuilding as you were, or be doing some functional training looking to load those shapes and patterns. But you almost need a little laundry list of what can I do now? What do I want to be able to do? And focusing on the enabling work. So your movement mechanics, whatever it is, it's going to help you achieve those shapes and positions before then loading them up. And as that slider shifts towards functional fitness, obviously the time allocation should shift as well. The thing I like in what you said there is when it comes to Olympic weightlifting and gymnastics, I would delay those until you're confident that you can hit the right shapes. Because if you're trying to load up a snatch and you can't do an overhead squat, that's going to make for a bad time. And I think especially for bodybuilders who are strong in specific shapes, their greatest risk of injury, because they could probably put too much on the bar and get it done when that connective tissue and those joints aren't conditioned to tolerate the loads that they can feasibly lift with their muscles. So putting those off until your basic compound positions are better. So have a good overhead squat, have a good front squat, be able to hang and do basic kip patterns using all the regressions, so all the simplified versions to build up. Because again, like if you're super strong in the upper body, you could probably do a huge number of ugly kipping pull-ups, but you're going to be allocating that stress to very localized areas rather than making it full body, using your core, using the lower body even, and letting the elbows
kit do the work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think when I look back to, so I've got some videos of me, and I still remember like the days doing it in Virgin Active Aldersgate with one of the other trainers, and this is kind of the bit where weightlifting was, I'm going to give it a little bit of a go. I have no right of doing it, and doing like a clean and what was not a jerk, but basically a press with 100 kilos. And I just, when I look back, it's like, I like stagger stance the jerk, and it's, and when I'm watching the snatches and I'm like seeing my shoulders all the way behind me, and it's 80 kilos on the bar. So it's like for a snatch, at the time I was probably weighing about, say, 85. So around a body weight snatch, with no control or resilience in those positions, I'm like, no wonder I fucked myself up. Like, and I got away with a lot of it for a lot of the time because I was relatively young, and so I was able to kind of recover-ish from some of those things. And it was more that was sprinkling in this random intensity. I wasn't just focusing on snatching every day. It was just like, let's try some snatches and get them done, and then nearly hurt myself. But I think that delaying those, as I say, that Olympic lifting for quite a while. And when you said there about the gymnastic stuff, like for me, I class like a box handstand push-up to be like the bodybuilding of gymnastic world, because it's your opportunity to add tempo, to take away half the body, to get into quality positions, now that hollow position, like do all these things on a box. And it's like, but because people see the wall as the end goal, that's the only option. But it's like, no, we'll get here. Let's focus on these positions, like you said there, because when we start nailing these positions and they become very subconscious how we're going to get into them, like that's what we want. Because when, as you said, when we are getting fatigued doing these a lot more glamorous movements on a bar or upside down and stuff, we want to make sure we're first of all comfortable when we're tired, using your hips, using yourself to get above the bar. Or even with handstands, are you comfortable being upside down? Like, when in life are you upside down? Like, how often? It's like just getting comfortable with that, all the blood rushing to your head and so forth. Like it's crazy. So obviously with that, and then as you say, like with the performance side of stuff, and make sure you're stimulating essentially the functional fitness endeavor just enough so that you can recover from it, and that you can keep sprinkling a little bit more, as you mentioned above, keep sprinkling just a little bit more until you are getting close to that 50-50, maybe all in at functional fitness.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think as a general rule of thumb, not going to your absolute capacity. Like bodybuilders, like we've said several times now in the episode, you're going to have a big capacity to do a lot if you really go to your limit. And if you can have the humility to work within yourself slightly, to accept that you're still making progress, but potentially not the fastest progress you possibly could. You're going to set yourself up for longer term, overall faster progress rather than short term progress right now. So say you could push press 100, but you're actually reining it in and still nudging up the amount you're push pressing from session to session, but not maxing out so that your technique goes to shit. That is actually a faster way to progress long term than trying to cash out right now today with the absolute max that you could possibly do, because your muscles will let you, but maybe other parts of your physiology might not.
Nice. So far, obviously, we've had how to divide the training with the transitioning. So obviously, you're going to be very segmented with it, making up words now. Then you've got your, again, choosing how fast you're going to go in, as Ash was basically saying there, but not going balls deep, going straight in and going all at once, because probably you're going to bite the bullet there, and making sure you're a bit boring, but understanding the sensible rate of progression so you can go faster long term. But I think a really key one is, why are you doing it? Why are you, like, the practical tip is write your why. Because if you're doing functional fitness from bodybuilding because it's the cool thing to do at this moment in time, it's going to be the wrong thing to do, because you're not going to have enough commitment to the long-term journey. Whereas if you're doing it to become competitive, or you're just doing it for like general physical preparedness or health, then fair enough. You're going to have two slightly different approaches to those, especially if you're going competitive compared to GPP. But both of them still have the same kind of principle of how you need to ease into it, no matter where your ending is. But understanding your why of why you're getting into functional fitness means that when you're in it and you're, say, using less weight, you're getting smaller if you're a bodybuilder, so you're losing some muscle mass, you're getting frustrated because mobility isn't quite there, so you're having to do all this extra, say, work that you don't normally need to do. If you've got a why behind all those bits, it makes them so easy to keep turning up to the gym those extra 15 minutes before, get your movement prep done, then, staying a little bit later or something, doing whatever afterwards. Do all those little bits through your session. You have so much more of an understanding why you're doing it, so you will stick with it, which means you will then get better.
Exactly. I think holding that front of mind, like Rob says, just contextualizes all the maybe less glamorous stuff you're doing. Remembering you're probably moving to functional fitness because you want to move better, feel better, have your body let you do more things outside of the gym. I think that's a common reason why bodybuilders move over, is that they've built themselves these massive muscle prisons, essentially, and they actually can't do all the things they want to do outside of the gym. So if you're trying to release yourself from that muscle prison, you need to learn these new skills of moving better. And if you are just slamming weight on as heavy as possible and you're going to end up hurting yourself, you're actually doing yourself a disservice there and going to take yourself further away from the goal of moving better, pain-free, and unlocking movements. So keeping that in the back of your mind, like, actually, this is why I'm doing it. That's why I'm not going to be an idiot and overdo this and end up hurting myself and set myself back from the goal of feeling better and moving better.
I think one of the last practical tips to really add in is low and slow cardio. Now, I don't really know what this is. I don't have a zone 2, but doing these low and slow sessions, especially if you didn't do any cardio as a bodybuilder, will be great for building up your foundations. Now, this, make sure with this caveat is you're choosing the correct equipment. And when I say equipment, that includes your body, of what this low CV is. That doesn't mean going out for a low steady state run for an hour, because that trauma on the body and your feet, from if you've never done any running before or done anything, to go from 0 to 12k, 15k, whatever, like, your body's going to fall apart. It's great, and we want to harness that enthusiasm, but maybe doing things more on the bikes, like the biker, the rowers, the skis to some degree, of getting an understanding of how to move with these bits of kit. Because especially if you're learning how to use these bits of, say, these ergs at a slow, steady pace, when we start to add that intensity that we've spoken about earlier, you know what the positions are you need to be in, you know how you're generating that power, that you're not just pulling all with your arms or vice versa. Like, you're using your lats on the ski, using your legs on the row, you're using your legs on the bike. Like, and with the assault bike, I was talking to someone earlier in the week about it. It's like, learning when you get that kind of build-up of lactate in your legs, of being able to kind of maybe shift to the upper body a little bit and then come back down to the lower body, understanding how to do that. That comes from low and slow. So you understand where your thresholds are and understand what's working.
Yeah, exactly. There's two components to it in my mind. That there's the skill of using the machine. So whether it is, like Rob said, running is probably not the best option for bodybuilders if you're super heavy and you haven't done much running before. So something a bit more low impact is a better idea. But the skill of using the machine will mean that you become more efficient at it when you do use it in high intensity workouts. But also we talked about trying to set yourself up from a positions point of view and be able to get into certain shapes to do certain movements. But this is setting us up from a metabolic point of view, in that the body gets used to long sustained output, which it potentially hasn't. So we become more metabolically efficient as well as having more efficient movement patterns. So the low and slow stuff, while it might be boring, it does lay a foundation to have a higher peak for the high intensity stuff. So especially like Rob said, if you haven't had much cardio in your program before, you're way better off building in more low and slow cardio to begin with, for sure, than trying to smash high intensity every day, because it's higher risk and the body's going to be less able to adapt to it because it's so sharp and sudden of a spike that the system is going to be massively stressed out about it. So building in, you can do simple stuff like even like 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes as part of your warm-up or cool down to just get used to sustained efforts. For some people, that's going to be really tough to sit on a bike for 20 minutes if you've never done it before. It's just really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So
localized fatigue is killer.
Exactly. So adding that in and slowly, progressively overloading it, like we always say, is going to help you make that switch over rather than just going all in on day one and ending in disaster.
Yeah, so we don't want to put a downer if you have transitioned or you're transitioning right now. We just want to make sure we've kind of outlined some common mistakes and how we would recommend kind of either rectifying those mistakes, or if you're just about to do it or thinking about doing it, then maybe thinking about okay, maybe I won't just jump straight in, or if I am going to jump straight in, where am I going? Who am I going to talk to first to make sure I'm doing it in the most sustainable way possible, so you can do this as a long-term thing potentially, because it might just not be for you. And that's the thing. For some people, it's not. So I've loved this episode, mate. It's been great. It's right on my street what we want to talk about. So if you did enjoy it too, we would love for you to share it on social media. Maybe share it with another bro or broette that's kind of going and transitioning into maybe the functional fitness space. If you did enjoy it, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or you can head over to YouTube and subscribe to our channel. We would absolutely love that. Just search us, Lunge.lift. And apart from that, thank you very much for every week tuning in. We really appreciate every single one of you. The growing audience is really appreciated, so do keep spreading that word. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.